escrita de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos sobre Sri Lanka, en virtud de la resolución del Consejo 46/1. Es un honor para mí dar la bienvenida a señora Michelle Bachelet, Alta Comisionada para los Derechos Humanos, para presentar su actualización por escrito. Tiene la palabra. La lista de oradores se cerrará en 15 minutos. Gracias.
Gracias, señor presidente. Distinguished President, Excellencies, Council members have received a written update on Sri Lanka, A/HRC/49/9. It mainly focuses on developments since our previous report in February 2021 and demonstrates the vital need for the Council's continuing attention. There have been some recent signs of increased engagement by the government with OHCHR and certain steps to initiate reforms. The proposals to amend some provision of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and to release some detainees under the Act are welcome initial steps. I encourage the government to take further steps to address the fundamental problems with the PTA, as well as undertake the deeper legal, institutional, and security sector reforms that are critically needed to put an end to impunity and prevent any recurrence of past violations. Regrettably, the past year has also seen further obstruction and setbacks to accountability. Victims and their families continue to be denied truth, and justice. And the government's response to criticism has constricted democratic and civic space, including for essential human rights advocacy. My February 2021 report identified a number of underlying trends that threaten human rights. These trends continue to advance. The militarization of civilian government functions is further deepening. I remain deeply concerned by the concentration of civilian positions in the hands of military officials, some of them implicated in serious allegations of human rights violations. The expression of ethno-religious nationalism in state institutions has become more visible, increasing the marginalization and fear of minority communities and undermining reconciliation. Since the end of 2020, we have noted a significant increase in land disputes, mainly related to Buddhist heritage conservation or forestry protection, that are exacerbating grievances of minority communities and creating new tensions. I regret the erosion of independence of countries' key commissions and institutions, including Sri Lanka's Human Rights Commission, subsequent to passage of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. Victims' trust in the Office of Missing Persons, established to investigate the country's tens of thousands of enforced disappearances, is lacking. The forthcoming constitution drafting process will be an important test for the future independence of key institutions and should emphasize devolution and human rights. Excellencies, 2 years after the expression of commitments to pursue, and I will quote, inclusive, domestically designed and executed reconciliation and accountability process, end of quote, before this Council, the government has still not produced a credible roadmap on transitional justice towards accountability and reconciliation. I remain concerned by the continued suffering and anguish of victims and families of the disappeared, who call for truth and justice and seek to commemorate their loved ones. I urge the government to acknowledge their rights, urgently determine the fate or whereabouts of victims, bring perpetrators to justice, and provide reparations. Victims of the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings and religious leaders also continue to call for justice, reparation, and a full account of the circumstances of those attacks, in particular the role of the security establishment. I am also deeply concerned by continued reports of surveillance, harassment, and intimidation of civil society organizations, human rights defenders, and journalists by police and intelligence services. Repeated incidents of death in custody and in alleged armed encounters with police are alarming. We also continue to receive allegations of ill treatment and torture by police and military. This highlights the importance of fundamental security sector reform. Mr. President, our previous reports to the Council have detailed the failure of successive governments of Sri Lanka to prosecute international crime and serious human rights violations and to pursue an effective transitional justice process. The current government has not only demonstrated its unwillingness to pursue accountability, it has incorporated military officials implicated in alleged war crimes into the highest levels of government, reinforcing a narrative of impunity. For these reasons, and to provide some forms of redress for victims, I have called on the Council to pursue alternative strategies to advance accountability at the international level. Regarding our implementation of the accountability-related aspect of Resolution 46/1, preparatory work is underway. Our team will analyze the information that has been consolidated in the evidence repository using a criminal justice perspective, with a view to identifying gaps and priorities for further information collection and incorporating a victim-centered approach. I must note the considerable scale of the work required from my office, noting that it will require time, adequate human and financial resources, and cooperation by states, including to investigate and prosecute perpetrators of international crimes committed by all parties in Sri Lanka through judicial proceedings in their jurisdiction under accepted principles of extraterritorial or universal jurisdiction. The mandate under the Resolution 46/1 presents an important opportunity to pursue accountability for serious international crimes committed in Sri Lanka. This is a vital task. As long as impunity prevails, Sri Lanka will not achieve genuine reconciliation and sustainable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias, alta comisionada. Comenzaremos a escuchar a la delegación del país concernido. Tiene la palabra el distinguido representante de Sri Lanka, Su Excelencia, tiene 5 minutos. Gracias.
Mr. President, the Resolution 46/1 on Sri Lanka was adopted by a divided vote in this Council. Sri Lanka and other member states opposed this resolution in fundamental disagreement with its deeply flawed procedure and unacceptable content, in particular its operative paragraph 6 regarding a so-called evidence-gathering mechanism. The resolution was directly contrary to the Council's founding principles of impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. It went well beyond the mandate that member states conferred on it by UNGA Resolution 60/251. I have stated Sri Lanka's views on this matter to this Council on the 1st of March. We also submitted in a timely manner our comments on the High Commissioner's report. We note with regret that the Secretariat failed to publish this simultaneously with the High Commissioner's written update. Despite our rejection of the resolution, we will continue our voluntary international undertakings on human rights and engage with the United Nations, including with this Council. As stated by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa of Sri Lanka to our Parliament on the 18th of January 2022, we are a nation that respects international laws and conventions. We have regularly shared our progress and challenges in a candid and open exchange with this Council and other relevant organs of the United Nations system. We are convinced that there are serious anomalies and weaknesses in the report presented to this Council by the High Commissioner. The fundamental deficiency is its intolerably intrusive character, impinging as it does on core functions and responsibilities of organs of the Sri Lankan state, overwhelmingly mandated by the people of our country at 3 successive elections. There is as well a clearly discernible element of discrimination in that the Council would certainly not take it upon itself to embark on a similar inquisitorial procedure in respect of other member states. This in itself, Mr. President, strikes at the very root of the foundations of the United Nations system. The issue of uniformity and consistency of standards applied by the High Commissioner to member states, irrespective of their size and influence, and in steadfast conformity with the essential principle relating to the sovereign equality of all members of the United Nations fraternity is cynically transgressed in several portions of this report. To our minds, this is particularly disturbing because the strength and prestige of the United Nations, and especially the Human Rights Council, derive from the widespread regard of the international community as a whole for the moral and ethical basis underpinning the attitudes of the Council. We fervently believe that this is vitally important to retain this confidence undiminished, especially having regard to the fate of the Human Rights Commission, the predecessor of this Council. It is a matter for deep regret that numerous instances of unsubstantiated allegations and superficial conclusions, insensitive to the complexity of ground situations, have found their way into the report. We have commented on these in extensive detail in our written response. We are dismayed by the High Commissioner's unwarranted onslaught on seminal institutions of our country, which function under the aegis of Sri Lanka's constitution and legal system, emanating from a rich and varied cultural heritage, and are subject to stringent review processes which form an integral part of our tried and tested laws. There is also the question of the use of stringently limited resources in such a manner as to achieve optimal benefit for all of humanity at a time of unprecedented crisis. The colossal expenditure of millions of dollars in a partisan and specifically targeted pursuit of Sri Lanka is hardly consonant with this obvious imperative. It seems to us a great pity that the report shows scant regard for these considerations, which appear to a wide swath of nations to be crucially important at this time. The government of Sri Lanka is firmly resolved to maintain the security and stability that we have restored for our people and ensure sustainable progress in an equitable manner. My country, Mr. President, reaches out to the international community with a sincere exhortation to join us as partners on a footing of equality and mutual respect to face the challenges ahead. I thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias, Su Excelencia. La lista de oradores está cerrada. Invito ahora a las delegaciones a formular preguntas a la alta comisionada y hacer comentarios sobre su actualización oral. Y comenzando con la lista, tiene la palabra la Unión Europea.
Mr. President, the EU thanks the High Commissioner for her update and welcomes the Office of the High Commissioner's work on accountability in line with Resolution 46/1. The EU acknowledges the proposed, though limited, reform of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and urges further efforts to bring it in line with international standards. We welcome the recent releases on bail related to the PTA and encourage further releases. We condemn the ongoing surveillance and harassment of civil society organizations, as well as the intimidation following a recent statement made by a representative of Sri Lanka's civil society before the European Parliament. We urge Sri Lanka to ensure safe civic space. We welcome the transfer of the NGO Secretariat from the Ministry for Defense to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but regret that so far this has not led to concrete improvements for NGOs. We stress the importance of democratic space and strong and independent transnational justice institutions, such as the Office of the Missing Persons. Emblematic cases need to be addressed. Accountability must be ensured. We continue to be concerned about any form of discrimination against persons belonging to religious and ethnic minorities and call for inclusive dialogue with all. Madam High Commissioner, what concrete steps should Sri Lanka take to promote reconciliation and accountability? I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Países Bajos en nombre de un grupo de países.
I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the 3 countries of the Benelux, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. We thank OHCHR for its report on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. We share the concerns of OHCHR on the erosion of democratic institutions, the independence of the judiciary, and the lack of accountability for past human rights violations. This not only undermines the democratic system, but also impedes reconciliation. President Rajapaksa mentioned his ambition to build a prosperous, stable and secure future for all Sri Lankans. The Benelux urges Sri Lanka to implement this and promote and protect the human rights of the people of Sri Lanka, including those of all minorities to this end. We know that the government of Sri Lanka has taken first steps to initiate reforms. However, we also see developments that undermine these steps and hamper deeper institutional reforms. There is a long road ahead, and the Benelux countries encourage the Sri Lankan government to fully cooperate with OHCHR and to ensure credible and tangible process in advancing reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. This is not only in the interest of the victims and survivors, but more generally of sustainable peace, prosperity, and justice in the country. We would like to ask the High Commissioner how the international community can best support the roads towards reconciliation, including accountability for past human rights violations in Sri Lanka. We thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Noruega en nombre de un grupo de países.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor of making this statement on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We thank the High Commissioner for her update, noting with regret the limited progress made on Council Resolution 46.1. We welcome the release on bail of Prevention of Terrorism Act prisoners, including Anaf Jassim and Hijaz Hizbullah, but remain concerned about others still in custody. We are encouraged by the move to amend the PTA. However, we are concerned that the proposed changes are insufficient to address human rights and due process concerns. We urge Sri Lankan authorities to ensure freedom of speech, including for human rights activists, journalists, and members of minority communities. We call upon the authorities to put an end to surveillance and intimidation of civil society, including arbitrary arrests. We are concerned about the lack of progress in the areas of transitional justice, accountability, and reconciliation, and encourage the government to increase their efforts in this regard. We urge the government to ensure the independence and effectiveness of institutions dealing with these issues. We are also concerned about reports of deaths of persons in police custody and encourage proper investigations of these events. We call upon Sri Lanka to cooperate fully and effectively with the High Commissioner and the UN institutions to ensure full implementation of Council Resolution 46.1. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene la palabra el Reino Unido por video.
This statement is by the Sri Lanka Core Group comprising Canada, Germany, North Macedonia, Malawi, Montenegro, the United Kingdom and the United States. We thank the High Commissioner for her update. We acknowledge first steps by Sri Lanka to address key reforms, but note that progress since Council Resolution 46/1 is limited. In particular, slow progress by the Office of Missing Persons in fully investigating cases since the release of the preliminary list of missing persons is troubling. Our concerns over surveillance and intimidation of civil society persist, and detentions, threats and intimidation of journalists and human rights defenders continue. It is crucial that civic space remains open. The releases on bail of Anaf Jassim and Hijaz Hizbullah are welcome as our first efforts to bring the Prevention of Terrorism Act in line with international human rights law. But the proposed changes to the PTA are very limited and our long-standing concerns remain. The new One Country, One Law task force risks undermining Sri Lanka's pluralist society. We urge Sri Lanka to ensure that this task force work is inclusive and non-discriminatory. We call for full cooperation with the High Commissioner and remain ready to support the government on the implementation of Resolution 46/1.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Arabia Saudita en nombre de un grupo de países. Por video.
السيد الرئيس، لقد أخذت بعثات دول مجلس التعاون علما بتقرير المفوضة السامية لحقوق الإنسان حول سريلانكا، ونشكر الحكومة السريلانكية على جهودها ومساعيها لتعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان وعلى تعاونها مع آليات مجلس حقوق الإنسان. السيد الرئيس، تأمل بعثات دول مجلس التعاون أن تكون التقارير المعدة تستقي معلوماتها من مصادر موثوقة وموضوعية وحيادية، ونؤكد على أن تعزيز حقوق الإنسان حوارا بناء وتعاونا مع الدولة المعنية، حيث أن الدولة هي التي تتحمل المسؤولية الأساسية عن تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان على أراضيها. كما نؤكد على أهمية الالتزام بالمبادئ العالمية والموضوعية وعدم الانتقائية والابتعاد عن التسييس عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Alemania.
Mr. President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. Germany remains strongly committed to human rights, reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka. We welcome initial steps forward, like the proposed amendments of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the recent releases on bail. However, more comprehensive reforms are urgently needed to bring counter-terrorism legislation in line with international standards and allow civil society to operate freely and safely. We are deeply concerned about the independence of key institutions, namely the Office of Missing Persons and the Office for Reparations, as well as of the National Human Rights Commission. The rights of religious minorities and all communities must be protected. More inclusive governance is needed to strengthen human rights, reconciliation and accountability. Attacks against human rights defenders are unacceptable. Safe and open space must be ensured, also for dissent. We reiterate our strong conviction that ensuring accountability and justice for victims and survivors is essential for genuine reconciliation and sustainable peace. Madam High Commissioner, how can human rights defenders be better protected? Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Egipto.
يأخذ وفد مصر علما بتقرير المفاوضة السامية لحقوق الإنسان حول سريلانكا، ونؤكد على أهمية الالتزام بمبادئ العالمية والموضوعية وعدم الانتقائية والقضاء على المعايير المزدوجة عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان، والابتعاد عن التسييس لحقوق الإنسان واستغلالها للتدخل في شؤون الداخلية للدول، مع إيلاء عناية ببناء قدرات المؤسسات الوطنية والتعاون الفني. كما نعيد التأكيد على أهمية مواصلة المجلس والمفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان تعزيز الحوار والتنسيق مع الدولة المعنية عند التعاطي مع أي قرارات خاصة بها، وذلك لضمان تحقيق مردود إيجابي وتقديم الدعم اللازم وفقا للأولويات الوطنية لكل دولة وفي ظل الاحترام الكامل لسيادتها. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Montenegro. Embajadora, tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. Montenegro has already expressed some of its key stance as a member of the Sri Lanka core group. We welcome the initial steps of the government to address some key issues related to the legal, institutional, and security reforms. A more comprehensive and deeper reform agenda, however, is needed for Sri Lanka to comply with its international obligations and to prevent a recurrence of grave human rights violations. We emphasize that the upcoming constitutional process should lead to the independence of the judiciary and other key institutions and the devolution of political authority. This is key for a genuine reconciliation and the full enjoyment of the human rights of all Sri Lankans. To this end, we call on the government to fully consider the numerous and consecutive recommendations by various UN human rights mechanisms. We also call on the government to conduct a transparent, open, and inclusive public debate on the draft constitution before it is presented to the Parliament. The lack of substantial progress in the domestically driven accountability and reconciliation process further underscores the need for the government to also adopt and implement comprehensive transitional justice measures. To this end, we welcome the OHCHR's increased involvement in certain issues of the accountability process and recall the critical importance of securing the necessary budgetary allocation for its work. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la República Democrática de Corea.
Thank you, Mr. President. In our view, country reports before the Council often debates from the principle of objectivity and non-bias, relying on unverified and groundless information spread by media and dishonest forces for the sinister political purposes rather than information provided by the concerned country. Politically motivated pressure and biased approach is counterproductive that undermine the dialogue and cooperation for the genuine promotion and protection of human rights. We note with appreciation the sincere efforts made by the government of Sri Lanka for the promotion and protection of human rights in the country, despite many challenges. The community of nations must support any initiative in good faith that contributes to preserving reconciliation and stability in the country, always acting with help in accordance with the decisions taken by the government of Sri Lanka, the sovereign state. We urge the HRC or OHCR to encourage genuine dialogue and cooperation with Sri Lanka, carry out the work based on its mandate in an objective and impartial manner, and stand against politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Canadá.
Canada welcomes the High Commissioner's written update on Sri Lanka and the OHCHR's continued efforts with regards to the accountability process. We note with concern the limited meaningful action to address past and ongoing human rights violations since Council Resolution 46/1. The lack of progress since the release of the list of missing persons by the Office of Missing Persons is disappointing. Meaningful peace and reconciliation requires civilian-led governments, an independent judiciary, meaningful civil society space, and respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. While we acknowledge proposed amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act, these do not go far enough to address long-standing concerns, including the persistent culture of intimidation and surveillance of NGOs, human rights defenders, journalists, and religious minorities, including recent arbitrary arrests of Muslims under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Recently, human rights advocates have been targeted for expressing their views, and acts of memorialization by Tamils continue to be repressed. The human rights situation could deteriorate further as long as the underlying issues that drove division and led to decades of violence and conflict in Sri Lanka remain unaddressed. We encourage Sri Lanka to uphold its human rights obligations and engage constructively with the OHCHR. Canada believes Resolution 46/1 is a step towards securing a safe, peaceful, and inclusive future for Sri Lanka, and we stand ready to support efforts towards this goal. Madam High Commissioner, how can we collectively help advance accountability and reconciliation and end impunity in Sri Lanka? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Filipinas.
Chair, the Philippines voted against HRC Resolution 46/1 as we disagree with the role being set for the OHCHR in collecting evidence and developing strategies for future accountability processes. The decision of the OHCHR to establish an accountability project is a breach of the text of the mandate and, in effect, a usurpation of the role of the state as duty bearer. We are not convinced that OHCHR has the mandate and capacity to carry out this so-called project with the highest standards of objectivity and professional rigor. The exorbitant cost of the mandate in the region of $3 million, mainly for the salaries of 12 new P-level UN staff for 1 year, has little to offer to concrete programs to strengthen national accountability mechanisms. We ask the Council to re-examine more closely the PBIs of country resolutions and to promote transparency on this issue. We acknowledge Sri Lanka's long history of constructive engagement with the OHCHR and the UN mechanisms and the government's efforts in pursuing reconciliation, accountability, and human rights through inclusive domestic processes. Noting the recommendations in the OHCHR report in areas of accountability, counterterrorism, civic space, what opportunities for collaborative technical cooperation between Sri Lanka and the UN are there, and how could this be informed by development realities and political complexities on the ground? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Nepal.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, we thank the High Commissioner for the presentation of the report. We take note of the engagement of OHCHR and the government of Sri Lanka in preparation of the report. The engagement of Sri Lanka with the human rights bodies and mechanism, including the arrangements of visit of a special procedure, is commendable. We also appreciate the efforts of Sri Lanka in implementing the voluntary commitments to enhance cooperation in the field of human rights. To that end, we note Sri Lanka's efforts in promoting national unity and reconciliation, including the initiatives executed through the Office of Missing Persons, Office for Reparations, among others. Mr. President, in view of Nepal's own experience of a successful homegrown and nationally led peace process, we underscore that such aspects need to be given due consideration while promoting reconciliation, accountability, human rights, and lasting peace in Sri Lanka. We believe that the Council's work should be guided by the spirit of genuine dialogue and cooperation and should be based on the objective, non-selective, and impartial approach while refraining from the politicization of the human rights issues. Furthermore, the support of the country concerned is critical in the Council's efforts for the universal protection and promotion of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tiene la palabra Kenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Kenya takes note of the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the role of advancing reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in the context of Resolution 46/1, adopted on the 23rd March 2021. We commend the government of Sri Lanka for the renewed openness and willingness in collaborating with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in implementing voluntary commitments in accordance with the Constitution and its international obligations. We note that these commitments are reconciliatory and therefore critical in unifying the country. We also recognize the role of the national institutions of Sri Lanka government in continuing to address matters relating to human rights obligations and encourage the government to continue pursuing full achievement of sustainable peace and reconciliation for its peoples. Kenya calls upon the Human Rights Council to continue with the constructive engagement and support Sri Lanka and the implementation of its national programs in order to achieve its domestic priorities for its development. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the distinguished Ambassador of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have taken note of the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka and her oral remarks. As its friend and immediate neighbor, India has consistently called upon Sri Lanka to fulfill its commitments on addressing the issues related to protecting the interests of Tamil in Sri Lanka. India believes that it is in Sri Lanka's own interest that the expectations of Tamils in Sri Lanka for equality, justice, peace, and dignity within a united Sri Lanka are fulfilled. This applies equally to the commitments made by Sri Lankan government on meaningful devolution, including through the 13th Amendment to Sri Lankan Constitution. We have taken note of engagements by the government of Sri Lanka with the members of the international community and other relevant organizations on various aspects of human rights situation and reconciliation issues in Sri Lanka. We would like such engagements and productive and purposeful dialogue to continue among the relevant stakeholders. The report raises important concerns on promoting reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. We call upon Sri Lanka to take the necessary steps to address the legitimate aspirations of the Tamil community, including by carrying forward the process of reconciliation and implementation of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka to ensure that the fundamental freedoms and human rights of all its citizens are fully protected. We will continue to urge the Sri Lankan government for the early conduct of elections to the provincial councils in keeping with its commitments to devolution of power. I thank you, Mr. President.
Et maintenant, je donne la parole à l'ambassadeur de la France.
Monsieur le Président, Madame la Haute Commissaire, la France vous remercie pour votre rapport. Sri Lanka fait l'objet d'un suivi du Conseil depuis 2015 et l'adoption de la résolution 31. Au cours de cette période, de nombreux rapports, débats et résolutions ont permis de proposer des réponses aux difficultés engendrées par les violations des droits de l'homme et le processus de réconciliation en cours. Ce Conseil s'est efforcé d'adopter une approche coopérative afin d'aider le gouvernement sri-lankais à mettre fin aux discriminations, aux injustices et aux exactions documentées par les rapports successifs du Haut-Commissariat et des organisations non gouvernementales. La France appelle le gouvernement sri-lankais à poursuivre et à approfondir sa coopération avec les Nations Unies et en particulier avec le Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme. Cette coopération est essentielle pour assurer une meilleure protection des Sri-Lankais contre les discriminations et les violences qu'ils sont encore trop nombreux à subir. Elle est nécessaire pour renforcer l'indépendance du système judiciaire, offrir toutes les garanties nécessaires aux victimes d'exactions et lutter contre la réduction de l'espace civique. La France salue les annonces du gouvernement au sujet de la réforme de la loi de prévention du terrorisme et l'encourage à poursuivre dans cette voie. Elle se tient à la disposition du gouvernement du Sri Lanka pour maintenir un dialogue ouvert et franc sur la situation des droits de l'homme dans ce pays. Je vous remercie.
Merci, monsieur l'ambassadeur. Este fue el último orador que pudimos acomodar en esta reunión. Nos lleva al final de esta reunión. Nos volveremos a reunir el lunes a las 9 de la mañana para continuar con el diálogo interactivo sobre la actualización escrita de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos sobre Sri Lanka y para celebrar la reunión dedicada a la intensificación de la cooperación técnica y el fomento de la capacidad para la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos de las personas que se encuentran en situaciones de vulnerabilidad y marginación en el contexto de las actividades de recuperación llevadas a cabo durante la pandemia del COVID-19 y después de esta. Con esto doy por concluida la 11ª reunión del 49º periodo de sesiones del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Buen fin de semana para todas y todos.